there's begun a dialogue between the Sikh community and the Presbyterian community. And I believe it's very important for us to provide an opportunity for this dialogue to take place. You may recall that shortly after 9/11, the Sikh community suffered a lot of violence and of mistreatment following that. And we showed here during the first year of the Center at West Park a film that was about that whole experience. So this has been an issue that's been on our minds. And it's also part of our tradition as Presbyterians to seek to be leaders in that kind of dialogue as we begin to try and understand one another better. And with that, I would like to introduce my colleague Christine Hong from the Peace USA in Louisville, who's our national interfaith staff person. And you'll take it from there, Christine.
Sure, great. Simran and I are gonna, do you mind if we come sit right here?
Not at all.
Okay. So we started this dialogue specifically during this week because this is the United Nations week that they've declared as Interfaith Harmony Week. So during this week, we reflect on I guess what it takes to really build harmony and peace among religious peoples and among all peoples. And often when we celebrate interfaith harmony, we don't reflect on all of the blood, sweat, and tears it takes to get there. And we're not quite there yet. And so Interfaith Harmony Week is a time that we really reflect on how are we part of the process of building peace among all people. So I want to pass out this General Assembly, just really brief description of Interfaith Harmony Week that you can take with you and look at. And also, we will be doing a series of dialogues again in October of this year. And we want to pass out a sign-up sheet just so that we can keep in touch with you and let you know what's going to happen in the city. And there's a pen there too.
Yes, thank you.
But also just for you to send us your ideas of, as we've been doing this yesterday, we saw that a lot of folks were getting inspired on their own of how they could get involved in building more peace in their community. And so we want to hear your ideas too of what you could do possibly in your neighborhood or in your church. It's just a way, you can put whatever way you'd like for us to contact you. And I'm going to pull up. So before we start, or as we start, Simran and I just want to share with you why we're doing this. So it wasn't an accident that we came together, that we started a dialogue. The Presbyterian Church is coming forth to this General Assembly with an interreligious stance. And it's a stance that offers guidelines on how do we come into authentic and mutual relationship with persons of different faith traditions. And part of this development of this document was to bring together about 65 Presbyterians in Stony Point, New York, to have a really long conversation of what does this mean for us in our lives? How do we theologically approach this? How do we approach this in our neighborhoods, in our families? So we invited Simran to come and speak to us about how he felt, what he would like to see come out of this stance. And he said something really powerful that still sticks with me today. And he said, I'd like to see love infused into every part of what you say, of this policy. So after he said that, I was really excited. This is exactly what we want for the church. I was on this real just happy, spiritual uplift zone. I was really excited. And I get home and I get an email from him. And I'll let Simran share what that was about.
Sure. Yeah, it was the day after Christine and I met at the consultation. We met on a Friday, so this was a Saturday, and one of my good friends who's a professor at Columbia, another Sikh gentleman, was assaulted in a hate crime. And he was brutally beaten to the point he fractured his jaw, displaced his teeth. It was about 24 young boys who chased down my friend, yelling Osama, yelling terrorist, tackled him and just, puncture wounds in his arms, all sorts of things. So it was a really, I guess, emotional moment for many of us. In many ways, we've grown up knowing people who have been attacked, but this was my best friend, and it's also somebody who fits into the same profile as me. I'm also at Columbia University. I also live near where he does. And to think and to realize that, this is happening in our own neighborhoods really woke me up to some issues that I had been trying to ignore or think weren't relevant to me and the people in my neighborhood. So this was the moment when Christine and I started connecting about what can we do here in the city and also around the country.
And I remember hearing this from Simran and feeling really helpless and thinking, what good is it for us as a church to create policy like this when we have no way of reacting now in a time of crisis of someone that we invited to speak to us about love? And what good is it to have a document unless we have people doing the work and neighborhoods who support neighborliness. So a colleague of mine, Mark Koenig, who works at the Presbyterian ministry at the UN, came together with Simran and decided that we wanted to host a series of dialogues, first in New York City, at the place where this happened, to talk about what we can do to make a difference, to share our stories, to provide a platform for the Sikh American community to talk to Presbyterian Christians about who they are. And I can tell you that moment was a moment where, even though I've been doing this work for a long time, this hit home for me. It suddenly became very real. I don't know if you have had a moment where an issue of justice suddenly became very real for you. Not something that happens out there or on the news or when someone tells you about it, but something that affects you personally, affects your family, affects your church, affects your neighborhood, however it may happen. And I want to just offer about 20 seconds for you to think about a moment in your life where an act of violence, where an act of hate, an act of injustice touched you in a way that it changed you. So I just want to invite about 20 seconds for you to think about that. So hold that story in your mind, that moment and those feelings in your mind's eye as you hear this dialogue. And I also want to invite you to participate in this dialogue. This isn't just a conversation between myself and Simran, but it's a conversation we want to have with you together. And so any moment you want to jump in and share your story or ask a question, I invite you to do that. So I'd like to just start by asking Simran, when was your moment? What was a moment when this all hit home for you? When injustice became something that you didn't just hear or see, but it became something that you actively worked against?
Sure. I grew up in Texas, in South Texas. And so you can imagine that someone who looks like me in Texas had many of these moments.
Marsha's from Texas.
Oh, great. Okay, so you might understand that there aren't many of us down there that look like this, and sometimes people aren't as accepting. I guess growing up, there were instances of discrimination and violence and bullying that we encountered on a day-to-day basis. I have three brothers. We were the only Sikhs in the town that we grew up in, San Antonio, which is a pretty big city. And so it was a regular experience for us. If you're asking for one moment, the one that sticks out to me, I think the obvious one would be 9/11, which you were mentioning before. I was in high school at the time. I was 17. And I think, like everybody else here, we probably all remember exactly where we were when we first heard about 9/11. I was in a classroom. We were watching the television. We didn't move from that spot for the next several hours. And when I finally went home, my parents locked the doors, and the phone was ringing off the hook. And some of the phone calls were death threats coming from people around us. Some of the phone calls were sick friends from around the country who were calling and saying, such and such person has been attacked. Such and such person is in trouble. Make sure you take care of your kids. Don't let them out. So we essentially were on lockdown for the next several days. And so it was a very striking moment for me. I think, all of us felt attacked as Americans. People who look like me felt doubly attacked, where you felt attacked as an American, and then you also felt attacked by your American peers. And so that was tough. There were many people who were supportive, especially our friends and our teachers and my soccer team, people who knew us. But it was in that moment that my life really changed, in the sense that I began to commit to creating awareness about our tradition and cultivating some sort of acceptance and love that obviously didn't exist at that point.
Sure.
I don't know, how about you? You must have
Yeah.
similar experiences.
I think it's neat that Simran and I are sitting together sharing our stories, because as a Christian and as a Presbyterian in the United States, I haven't experienced religious discrimination. I can, during Christmas, go to any CVS, Duane Reade, what have you, and 5 months before Christmas even hits, can find decorations and cards and all sorts of things that I need to celebrate a religious holiday, however secularized it has become. People don't. Some of the discrimination may come in nuanced shape, but overall, I don't really get the sense that I can't practice what I believe, or that people will look at me strangely for practicing how I believe, or thinking about out loud what it means to be a Presbyterian or a Christian. On the other hand, as an Asian American in this country, I felt a lot of discrimination. So I can remember the first time that I experienced racism, and that I remember it, was not when I was an adult and I could process it and understand it, but it was when I was in kindergarten. So when people tell you that children don't understand these dynamics and they're colorblind, I don't necessarily know that they are. Maybe they choose not to act, but they're watching. And they certainly, especially children of color, experience this. So yesterday we were talking about how, what does it mean? What do Christian parents tell their children at home as they raise them that is different from what sick American parents have to tell their children when they raise them at home? What are the different things people of color have to raise their children to be aware of and to know about versus people who are not? So for me, my experience was in kindergarten, and we lived in a part of Los Angeles that I didn't go to school there, and I had a scholarship, so I went to school in a different, more affluent part of town, but that's not where we lived. And so the bus didn't come to where we lived. So my great-grandfather had to walk me pretty far. We had to get up really early in the morning before the sun got up to walk to the part of town where the bus would come and pick me up. And it was like one of the first 2 days of school, and we walked all the way out there. I was so excited. The bus pulls up, and the door doesn't open. And I'm trying to get on the bus, and the door won't open, and my grandfather's knocking on the door, and I hear the bus driver through the window yell out at us, "You don't belong on this bus." And it was this assumption, later I found out, that because I was from this different side of town, and they didn't necessarily have diversity at the school where I was going to, that I was trying to get on the wrong bus. And so the bus went by, and I remember in that moment feeling incredibly powerless, even more powerless as a child, but even more lost because the man in my life that was the religious guide, that was sort of the moral compass, that was this strong person with authority that I really leaned on and I saw my parents lean on, became completely disempowered in a moment by a comment by a stranger. And what does that do to a child? When the person that they're looking up to suddenly becomes, in the eye of society, almost nothing in an instant. And I always take that with me. And And that's the place from which I come to understand what does it mean to build peace. What does it mean to build a just society? Even though I have certain privileges as a Christian, I don't necessarily have all the privileges, So that's how I come to this conversation. That's really where I come to my understanding. So I want to ask you, you talk a lot about, in our previous conversations, the importance of justice in the Sikh tradition. Can you say more about the importance of justice, love, and advocacy in your religious tradition, and also how you live your life and how you've lived that out?
Sure. Yeah, that's it's a complicated question, but I'll try.
Sure.
And, I'll start with, religious communities look at models. We look at exemplars. Who do we want to live like? And we have Jesus behind us, and Christians look to Jesus as a model for what do I want my life to look like. In the Sikh tradition, we look to our prophets, gurus we call them. And what I see in the life of our founder, Guru Nanak, is an absolute commitment to social justice. And his vision was such that we live in a way that is so inspired by love that we begin to express that love outwardly to everybody around us, to the creation. So to be religious for a Sikh is not limited to internal spirituality. It is prayerful action. It's always expressed. And so service is something that you will see central to the core of a Sikh, to the point where everything you see in a place of Sikh worship, a gurdwara, is oriented around that service. One of the things that Sikhs are most proud of that they've brought to the world is our community kitchens, langar, which essentially began 500 years ago as a homeless shelter, right? Let's feed people who need food. But it's all in the spirit of service, of giving, and it's love for us. It's interesting because one of the political issues we're struggling with in this country right now is that Sikhs have a long military tradition, serving in the military, and right now we're not allowed to serve the country that we've become a part of, and so it's a tough situation to be in where you want to be serving and you don't have that right.
Why?
So Sikhs are not allowed to serve in the U.S. military at this point because there's a ban on people serving in the military while maintaining articles of faith. So if you have a turban and a beard, like myself, you wouldn't be allowed in the military. Or if you have a yarmulke and facial hair, or if you have a skull cap like a Muslim, you wouldn't be allowed to serve. This is the current situation.
Or dreadlocks, I guess.
Or dreadlocks, right, exactly. So it's a challenge because there's a tension between the current uniform policy as it stands, and the freedom of religious expression. And when those two things come together, a number of communities are being affected. So it's actually a policy issue we've been addressing for the last several years through our work at the Sikh Coalition. We have received 3 exemptions so far for this policy. There are 3 Sikh males currently serving with their turbans and beards, each of whom has been received commendations and awards. So essentially what they've done is paved the way to say, look, we can serve, we have the strong tradition, and we can do it well. And so the hope is that over the next however long it takes, that we overturn this ban and all religious minorities can serve in the military freely.
Can you say more about the history of Sikh Americans and how long they've been here, the history of service?
Sure. Yeah, the Sikh community has been here in America for over 100 years now. They first arrived on the West Coast, and then they started arriving on the East Coast. So those are where the 2 biggest communities are. Here in New York, Queens is kind of the central location for the Sikhs, as it is for many immigrant communities and ethnic minorities. And there have been many, I guess, interesting contributions that Sikhs have made over the past 100 years, from the first the first congressperson, Asian American congressperson, was a Sikh. The inventor of fiber optics is a Sikh. There's a strong tradition of entrepreneurialism. My father came here as a PhD student, as an engineer. He ended up in San Antonio, opened up a company. Defense contracting is what they specialized in. So we were in San Antonio. He ended up creating 500 jobs for people in the military world in San Antonio. So these sorts of contributions are, part and parcel of how we see our service to the societies to which we belong.
And how does that affect children in schools, do you think, or in the education system, when the history of such a rich history of Sikh Americans isn't shared accurately, for one, or shared at all, for instance, in curriculum?
Right, it's tough. Even I, growing up, I didn't have any Sikhs around other than my family. I didn't know the history of Sikhs in America. I recently learned. I happen to be doing my PhD in Sikh history, but not many people have that fortune. I happened to learn through, my college and graduate work. Most people don't know. It doesn't come up in the textbooks. It doesn't come up in the curricula. So what ends up happening is, like you were mentioning your story of children going at children,
right.
or how these stereotypes emerge in our young people. That was very much the case. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I experienced growing up, and this is the case with a majority of young Sikhs around the country. We've done studies on bullying, and a large majority of young Sikh kids are bullied at their schools. They've reported all sorts of harassment. We recently saw a case of a young boy whose turban was set on fire in the middle of class. It was just like the most terrible things you can think of. And a large part of it comes from the fact that we just don't know about each other. Mm-hmm. We don't learn about each other. And we pick up on these memes or these practices that we see our parents doing or adults doing that make it seem like it's okay to discriminate against people, against other kids. So
Absolutely.
It happens.
And you bring up a good point, because a lot of times, as we respond to hate crimes, these are responses that as Presbyterians and Christians, we respond to crisis. So it's something bad has happened, now we're going to respond around it. But real, peace building does that, but it also works to prevent crisis. Right. So, and if we're not doing those two things hand in hand, what are we doing? Are we just putting a Band-Aid on our society every time something bad happens? What would you say to Christians out there and to Presbyterians who not only want to do the work of continuing to respond to crises like these, but want to do the work of prevention?
I think that's a great question, especially in the context of the Presbyterian Church, because there has been a long tradition within the church to address crises, but also to act proactively. And if we look at the civil rights movement and the Presbyterian role in that, they've proactively helped pave the way for justice in this country. I would also agree with you that Presbyterians have become, but I think America in general has become complacent in such a way that we respond to emergencies and don't do anything in the meanwhile. Sure. And it's true of my community as well. And what I would love to see is some sort of strengthening of relationships so that when issues emerge, we have something to lean on. Right now, a crisis emerges and we just kind of fill the gaps however we can. But we don't have a strong foundation, and that's what we really need to be building. Yeah.
One of the things that I hear a lot in traveling and listening to different people talk about their interfaith engagement is we know it's about building relationships in our neighborhood, but really, we don't really know how to do that. How do you build relationships? What would you say are some practical ways that people can, especially between Christians and Sikh Americans, maybe between congregations and gurdwaras, or even businesses, build good mutual relationships?
Sure. There are many ways to answer a question like this. I'll start with the hard way.
Sure.
Which is to say that there are many things about our lives, different aspects of our lives in which we are in positions of privilege. There are other aspects in our lives in which we're not. So for myself, I recognize that as a religious and ethnic minority in this country, I'm not in a position of privilege. However, with my education and my, my family's success in business, I am in a position of privilege. And I think, especially as people of faith, we ought to recognize what those situations are. Where are we in situations of privilege? And how do we, once we recognize that, which I don't think we tend to do, once we recognize that, how do we help other people who are oppressed or depressed? And how do we bring them up? In the case of Sikh Americans, we're not in a position of privilege, and Presbyterian Christians are. And what I would like to see, and what I'm hoping to see, especially with dialogue such as this, is some sort of recognition that being in a position of privilege and having a tradition of justice, we ought to be bringing up those other communities that aren't currently experiencing justice in this country. And whether that has to do with people on the basis of religion, like my own, or people on the basis of race, like what are we seeing with incarceration with African Americans? If we're seeing it on the basis of class. There are all sorts of disparities we have in this country, and we ought to be recognizing how to bring other people up. In terms of practical suggestions, I think there are many, but like you're saying, it really has to happen on the local level. These relationships will develop as soon as people start reaching out to one another. I mean, that's the basis, and it's incumbent on both sides. I have never seen a situation in which a Sikh was approached. We were just talking about it a few minutes ago, Sukhjit and I. We love it when somebody comes up to us and just says, "You're a Sikh." That recognition, I mean, I grew up in Texas and nobody said that to me for 20 years, you know. My parents have been here for far longer than that, and they've been working to create a name just for the tradition. So to build on that, to identify who these people are, and just to reach out and say, come over, come visit our church, or hey, we'll come to your Gurdwara and visit your community, something like that. That would be a very simple, easy, but meaningful step.
Sure. And I know a little bit about this being an Asian American and a Korean American, but what is the power in someone recognizing who you are? So you mentioned, someone to say you're a Sikh, to make that statement, and to acknowledge and affirm your part of your identity. What does that do for you?
Yeah, it's not a question that I've ever had to answer before, actually. So it's interesting for me to even think about, like, why does it matter to me that somebody identifies me? I guess part of it is just people. So part of it is knowing that much of the violence that has occurred against people who look like me is rooted in ignorance, and recognizing the importance of education and dedicating my life towards education. When somebody is educated enough or aware enough to recognize me, it tells me that there is progress being made. And over the last few years, despite the hate crimes that have continued, I've seen measurable progress, a lot of progress in terms of the public perception and recognition of Sikhs. I think another thing it does for me is we have a very visible identity. It's very clear to somebody who knows what a Sikh is when they see me that I'm a Sikh. It means a lot to me that somebody would know my core beliefs just by looking at me. They would know my values. And they can, and when it happens, typically, there is an element of respect that comes along with that. And that's very valuable, that's meaningful to me.
Sure. I would imagine knowing even things about the Sikh American or the Sikh articles of faith is really important. When people recognize that the turban is not just like a piece of cloth.
Right.
So can you share a little bit more in this circle about what those articles of faith are and perhaps what they mean to you spiritually and personally?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a question that I think people always wonder but are afraid to ask.
Yes.
For a Sikh, we have articles of faith which include our appearance, our hair, the bracelet. We carry this. We call it a kirpan. It's like a small dagger that we carry on us, and I wear it on a strap over my body and around. We have articles of faith that give us a very unique identity, a distinguishable identity, and for a Sikh, the central rationale behind these articles of faith, behind this identity, is not actually rational, I wouldn't say. For a Sikh, if you asked me, why do you wear that bracelet? The main reason for me is because I see it as a gift from our gurus. So this identity was given to us by our guru, and I accept it and I cherish it as a gift because I love my guru. So the closest example I can give, and it's not a perfect analogy, is like a wedding ring. If you have a wedding ring from your spouse, it means something to you because of what it symbolizes. It's that love. But it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody else, and you can't really communicate that. And it doesn't have some sort of functional value. I mean, you may use it to ward off other people and tell them something like that. But its primary value to you is not instrumental. Sure. It's just that basis of love. And that's what my identity is for me, and that's what it is for most Sikhs. With that said, I think there are many practical values, practical benefits for someone looking like this. So the negatives are obvious, many of them are, especially when it comes to stereotypes and violence and discrimination. Sure, that's there. But I also think that I have benefited a lot because of the way that I look. One of the things that I really take away from this unique identity is that it forces me to be accountable. And when people recognize me, or when I feel like I'm an ambassador of my faith everywhere I go, from as far back as I can remember, that forced me to practice my ethical principles from day one. So I remember very clearly not cutting in line at Six Flags when I was a kid, because I knew that people would say, oh, Sikhs aren't supposed to cut. You're supposed to be honest. And I know that my actions reflect on my community. And sort of the ethical cultivation that comes from that has been very useful for me. There's quite a bit of value that I've drawn from that. So that's one.
I wonder too, what types of assumptions people make about you because of your physical appearance and your articles of faith, and how you negotiate those assumptions, and where you see opportunities for developing good relationships in the midst of people assuming. So sometimes, for me, I know, having lived in different parts of the country, there are some parts of the country and some places where I'll go where people will be surprised when I open my mouth that I don't speak with an accent. And you see it on their face. And and you may think, oh, you're reading too much into it, and I've heard people say that before, but I'll tell you, when this has happened to you for 33 years, you can read it on people's faces. I'm not imagining it. And some people will even vocalize their surprise and say, let's say after I've preached a sermon or something, and sometimes I think in general women experience this. Someone will come up to you, put their hand on your arm and say, you are so articulate. And you hear the fill in the blank, articulate for what, right? For whom? For what category you would like, for which category you'd like to put me into, absolutely. And so,
or you speak really good English.
Yes, you speak really good English. And so you learn to navigate conversations like that. You learn to sort of watch for the assumptions. And in the beginning, I know for me, a lot of the assumptions would really make me angry. Because when you hear them once in a while, maybe it doesn't do anything to you as a person. But when you hear them constantly, what does it do to your selfhood? right? To your self-esteem, to your identity, to your personhood. And so you have to negotiate different ways to respond that aren't just anger. So you have to negotiate ways to have a conversation, to think about, well, how can I talk to this person beyond their assumption? How can we have a conversation now and not just end it here? How can I make sure this doesn't happen again? Because usually it's not coming from a bad place. So can you share some experiences that are similar in which you've had to negotiate the assumptions people make about you?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of phrasing the question, and your story brought up so many different stories from my childhood, and recently as well. So I guess in terms of negotiation, it really is dependent on context.
Sure.
And in some situations, I rely on humor. A lot of situations, I rely on humor. In some situations, I try and educate. In some situations, I don't, and I get angry. And I'm not an angry person, actually, and it happens very rarely, but I'm thinking about a few months ago, I was running in Central Park, and there was an Orthodox Jewish man sitting in a carriage, and I was running by, and he yelled, "Where are you going, Osama?" He yelled that to me, and it just struck me because here is another visible minority whose community has also been subject to persecution, and he was old enough to know better. So that was probably, I mean, it's a simple thing. I usually don't get upset when people say something to me, but feeling like he should be able to identify with me better. I reacted in a way that I never have before. I stuck up my middle finger and ran around the carriage a couple times, and I was just I didn't say anything. But it's totally not my personality, but it was just, it happens.
Poor horse.
There was, there are other stories. Humor is very...
That's very funny.
Humor is me. So like I had 3 brothers growing up, and like we would play up these stereotypes all the time, and just like, I mean, we did it because it was funny. We didn't think that we were challenging people. But one thing that we used to do regularly, we would go through drive-through lanes at fast food restaurants, and we'd put our order in, but we'd do it with a Texas accent. So we'd say, yeah, can y'all get some of those 3 hamburgers or something? And then we'd pull up to the front, and they'd be like, oh, sorry, we got the wrong order. We got this for somebody. They'd be totally confused about who we were. But it was a similar sort of thing where like humor was, central for us. Another thing that comes up is there are times when I get stubborn. Where I try to make my point and I know that I'm not going anywhere. I remember in college I was pulled over on my way driving up to Austin, and I was by myself at the time, and I was speeding. It wasn't, he didn't pull me over for no reason. But then he asked me where I was from, so I said San Antonio, and he asked me, where are you really from? And I said, you get these sort of microaggressions, and I said, oh, well, my parents really live in Bernie, which is a small town outside of San Antonio, and he didn't, I knew that wasn't what he meant, but I wasn't answering, until I said, oh, you meant where are my grandparents from? So I pushed back a little bit. Then there are situations in which I feel completely powerless. And I'm thinking of, I did a road trip recently with a college buddy of mine. We drove from here to Michigan to visit one of our old roommates. And my friend is white, red hair, freckles. He was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and we're driving through southern Ohio. We get pulled over, not speeding. And the officer comes over to his window and says, you in the passenger seat, can I see your license? And I was like, I wasn't even driving, that's crazy. Like, you could at least pretend to like run his, he didn't say you were speeding, nothing like that. So he took my license, took it back to the car, and I knew we're in southern Ohio, I don't know anybody there. So I just gave him my license, answered his questions, knew my place, and let it go. But that was, I think, one of the first times where I just felt like, 22 years I lived in Texas, never felt like that. Well, I totally felt like I had no control over what was going to happen. So yeah, all sorts of contexts. When it's kids say things. I can't hold it against them. Typically, I wouldn't say they don't know any better, but they don't have the mental maturity or the opportunity to develop a worldview in a way that I feel like I can hold them accountable. But when it's adults, it's a little bit different. When it was this hate crime in Harlem with my good friend, that was surprisingly upsetting to me that it was African Americans. Because again, they were kids, but they were also kids who know what oppression is. And it's not reality, but I'd like to think that there's some sort of, I guess, mutual understanding again, among oppressed communities. So.
Right. I think that's also something I've learned a lot as well, is that oppression like this and conflict like this, whether it's, especially in the United States, it's not only religious conflict, but often it's religious and racial ethnic conflict. It's a lot of different things wrapped together in one package. And often the way that we tend to tackle things as a society is to try to unpack all of those conflicts and deal with one issue at a time. So, even dialogues like this, we're trying to bring those two things together. Racial ethnic conflict, issues of justice that aren't just religious discrimination. And I think that's challenging in our society, to hold those different things together. Where was I going with this? I wanted to talk a little bit about, because one of the things that, going back to what you were saying, that I realize is that some of this religious discrimination, some of this racial ethnic conflict that happens with religious discrimination isn't just happening between like the Anglo-American population to the Sikh American community, right? Just like within the Asian American community, I might be saying something really controversial here on video right now, that we have within our Asian American community different prejudices against one another as well. Sure. That we don't necessarily verbalize in public or talk about, or even perhaps have a platform to talk about it and be heard. Right. And some of that is racial ethnic, some of that is a country of origin, some of that is language, but a lot of it is socioeconomic. So can you say a little bit about, and a lot of what that comes from is not understanding in our society that even within different groups of communities, that those communities in themselves hold so much diversity and richness, and often we refuse to see it, whether we're living in the community or outside of it. So can you say a little bit about how you've learned about the diversity within the Sikh American community and what that looks like? Sure.
Yeah, it's a funny thing when you look at any community that's not your own, you tend to assume that it's all the same, that it's a monolith and that everybody thinks the same and has the same background. I had the interesting experience of being a part of a community, but not really living within it. We were in South Texas. And I thought actually a similar thing about my own community. I assumed that everyone was like my dad. and when I first moved to New York, which I knew was a big population, I was excited because I thought everybody would be like me and they, love basketball and we play pickup all the time, and yeah, it was just going to be this great thing. And I was surprised somewhat to arrive here, meet a number of Sikhs my age, and realize that we didn't see the world similarly, not just ideologically, but things that I expected, like what sport would you like, what team would you like, and it was such in retrospect such a silly thing to have thought. I mean, I wasn't a dumb kid coming here, I promise, but yeah, I realized that that's not it's not, there's no complexity there. I wasn't recognizing the complexity.
You just hadn't thought about it.
I hadn't thought about it. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that is what we do with one another. And it was coming here that I realized for the first time that that not everybody thought the same way as me. Not everybody within my community understood religion the same way that I did. Also, the recognition of class difference was very interesting to me. There is a large community in Queens most of whom have arrived here as political refugees from India. Many of them are blue-collar workers. A lot of the people we see in the city driving cabs working at the delis. These are people who are here as political refugees in a very different sort of class situation than I would have expected, because I was just blind to it growing up. So recognizing this diversity has been very interesting to me. Very important, I think, in expanding my own worldview, not just in how I see my own community, but how I see other communities as well.
Yeah. And I'd say that's a key aspect of doing interreligious relationships or multi-faith learning well, is that you not only build relationships across and build bridges to people of other faiths and traditions, but you're doing this also simultaneously in your own tradition as well.
Right.
So, and if you're not doing it among, for us as Christians, if we're not doing it among Christians, we can never learn to do it well with people of other faiths, because we have the same internal issues.
Right.
Just like you're describing in the Sikh community, we have issues of class that we haven't dealt with. We have issues of justice, in our churches that we still haven't dealt with. We still have racism in our church that we haven't had full conversations about. So to deal with this simultaneously, both within the spaces that we claim and the spaces that we're invited to join of people of other faiths is important. And I think for me as a Christian, that's what I feel called to do. I don't know that I can do one without the other.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I agree. And I think in some ways, I don't know if you would agree, but in some ways I feel like interfaith is a lot easier than intrafaith.
Oh, sure.
Because in interfaith, you can at least, you can always go default and say, well, you believe something totally different, you have a different system, and so that's fine, whatever you want to believe. But in intrafaith, if I'm talking to another Sikh sitting next to me, and you interpret the scripture differently than me, then I have to reconcile that somehow. And that challenges you as an individual. It took me a while to figure out how to reconcile that and come to a point where I didn't have to be right or have to have an absolutist or exclusivist sort of view. But I think I do agree that it's a very important part of the sort of maturation process, both of a religious community and also for us as people of faith.
I'm going to ask one more question and invite you to share one more example with us, and then I really do want to hear from everybody here and sort of what the questions might be for Simran or myself. But the last question is, as we talk about building interfaith relationships, interreligious dialogue, and building relationships in general, both in our communities and between our communities, what are some moments where you have seen this work well as people respond in times of need or crisis? And what are some moments where you've seen this not work so well? So oftentimes we talk about the really good examples, the great examples that we like to put on the front page. But who asks the questions about the times when it doesn't? And I think we have just as much to learn from the great examples as we do from the moments where we fall short.
Sure. I think one thing that's been very successful that I really appreciated. We've started a program, we started in college. So I was the first Sikh to go to my undergraduate school. It was Trinity University in San Antonio. And it was right after 9/11. And I really wanted to create an organization, a Sikh Students Association, that would create awareness about our tradition. So I got a lot of my non-Sikh friends to join me. They created a board, we created an event. We started a thing called Turban Day, where we would tie turbans on people. And as we did so, we would explain, this is why we wear a turban, this is who Sikhs are. People loved it, they would get a photo up, have something to post to Facebook, whatever. So it was great, and it was really meaningful. It's been so successful that it's been picked up across the country, and now we're organizing for this year a National Turban Day. So that's a success story.
When's the National Turban Day?
we're hoping for the fall. But it should be, it's a great media event. People have just been so thrilled about it, and it's, nothing. We haven't seen anything like this in the country. So it's been really helpful. What would be a failed story?
Or a learning curve.
Yeah,
where,
I put a positive spin on it. One thing that we're struggling with is how to mobilize faith communities to care about other faith communities. This military issue is a very good example. So this is an issue that's not specifically a Sikh issue. It's an issue that affects all religious minority, not religious minority community, it affects religious communities who wear articles of faith, which is essentially every religious community, just different traditions within them. What we haven't been able to do is tell the narrative in such a way that it compels people of faith to say this is a justice issue. We haven't been able to get people to care, and I think that's the onus is partially on us for that. But I think it's also partially on our society for that, which is we have a very hard time caring about people who aren't us or we don't identify with. So it's an issue that there's a petition. We're trying to get it overturned. We've been in Congress. We've done hearings. We've been at the White House. All sorts. New York Times has written about it. Washington Post has written about it. I mean, it's all over the place. But we're not able to mobilize the masses, and we can't get people to care. And one of the things I'm very interested in figuring out how to do is what is it that we can do as people of faith to bring us all together on common causes? So whether it's something that affects Sikhs and Jews disproportionately, or whether it's something that affects Christians disproportionately, there should be some sort of collaboration that occurs that I don't see occurring, and I'm not sure what the next step is in putting that together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of, I want to hear a comment, Bob. But I'm reminded of one thing. You know, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, to me, your story means that the issues in your community that you're fighting for, if you claim them as justice issues, they're justice issues for me too. And that I can't think about it in a different way. And as people who want to be on the side of justice, Presbyterians, you know, this is really our theology and our faith and our tradition of activism. You know, what does it mean for us not only to pick and choose what those issues are, but to truly take up what Christ has taught us and commanded, which is, if you love this person as you love yourself, and I know you love yourself, you know, what does it mean when they're telling you this hurts? For you to deny it or to say, well, that other problem is a little bit more attractive to me. That we don't get to make those choices. And so I think it's a great challenge for those of us with religious privilege, or those of us who can come alongside in solidarity, and like you talk about, bring other people along the way. Bob?
No, what I was going to say is that the place of solidarity happens, that Sikhs have suffered a lot of these attacks because you're mistaken for Muslims, and the answer is like, oh, we're not Muslim. I mean, it's not like it would be justified if you were Muslim, and so how do you expand that sense of solidarity? You understand the question I'm asking?
Right.
You get this treatment because people are mistaking you. It seems to me that there's a broader.
Right. No, I think it's a great question, and it's something that our community has been grappling with. The fact of the matter is that in modern America, there is a new racial category, and that is the apparent Muslim. Anybody who looks Muslim is put into one box. And this includes people with brown skin, people with turbans, people with facial hair. In South Texas, this was a lot of my Hispanic friends who would be, you know, they would get ethnic slurs, you know, Saddam or Osama or whatever. So it's just what you look like. It's being conflated with terrorism and the war on terror. And it has become a major problem. Islamophobia is affecting a number of different communities. And as we've tried to figure out how to grapple with this question, I basically see two options. Our community has seen two options. One is what you're describing. You say, I'm not a Muslim, you're attacking the wrong people, go attack them. And that's something that's unacceptable to us as a community. And as people of faith, I think it's easy to make that argument in a room like this, where you would kind of have the same ethical convictions and say that's wrong. Strategically, if you're thinking about your community in a vacuum, strategically it's not the best option. Sorry, that would be the best option, but it's not the best ethical option. What we've chosen to do as a community is the more difficult, but the more ethical option, which is we take the opportunity to say we're not Muslims, we're Sikhs, learn about us. And then we say, even if we were Muslims, it would be wrong. So it's a two-step process, and it's a very difficult process because it leaves for quite a bit of complexity. And as you see in situations like this, complexity it doesn't always work. So essentially, if you think about our approach, our community, and I'm very proud of where our community has taken its stance on this. Our community is essentially, if you imagine a whole, and the Muslims and the Sikhs and Hispanics and Arabs and people of different nationalities, we're all in this whole together. What we could be doing is climbing out ourselves, right? The Sikhs have an opportunity to essentially stand on the heads of the other minorities in that whole and pull themselves out by saying, you stay down. What we're opting to do is take a different approach, which is uplift ourselves, but at the same time uplift other communities who are being targeted and discriminated against. So again, it's a longer process, it's a more challenging process, but it is what we believe to be the ethical approach, and that's what we're doing. It has created solidarity, but it has led to continued discrimination in a way that is problematic.
Can I ask a really simple question, just in light of what you were saying about being recognized as a Sikh? Is there a greeting that you think that a Sikh person would generally appreciate hearing from a non-Sikh person
Sure.
on the street?
Yeah, the most common greeting, Sat Sri Akal, which is something that we've been saying for years. I'll repeat it. It essentially means Sat is truth, Akal is eternal. So the truth, which is our synonym for God, is eternal, which is also a word we use for God. So in a way, you're saying God is God, right? But what you're really saying is the qualities of God. Truth is forever. And it's something that we say as a community. So the word is Sat Sri Akal.
Sat Sri Akal.
Yeah.
Sat Sri Akal.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, as Sukhjit and I were talking about before, you can even just say, I'll tell you a funny story. When I first moved to New York, anytime I would go to Times Square, you know how those hip hop artists hand out their CDs and sell them for $10? I would get duped into buying a CD every single time I went to Times Square because they would say, hey, sing. And I'd be like, oh, you know who I am? You know I'm a Sikh? And I'd go up and I'd buy a CD. But yeah, Singh is our traditional last name. For males, and for women it's Kaur, K-A-U-R. One of the core values in our tradition is egalitarianism. Everybody is equal. And there are practical ways in which our gurus attempted to establish this. So what they did was they erased last names, which indicated your caste or your class or what your family profession was, and said everybody will have these last names, Singh and Kaur. These last names are traditionally royal last names, so they were also a way of empowering people to say, from now on, your only class is royalty. Everybody is great. So that's something else you might recognize when you see a Sikh person.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
There's a public radio announcer who has a first name that's Hindu, I think, and a last name that's Sikh.
Okay.
Lakshmi Singh.
Lakshmi Singh, that's right, on NPR, that's right.
Does that have any? I thought she was Hindu until today.
Oh no, she probably is. I don't know her religious conviction. It's not the case that every Singh you'll meet will be a Sikh.
Got it.
The name Singh comes from a larger lineage. It means lion. and it's a larger lineage of royalty. So she might be drawing from another tradition of Singhs. And then Sikhs adopted the name Singh as something that we would all take on. The turban is another example of this sort of empowerment. In the South Asian context, turbans were essentially reserved for royalty. Only the high-powered people would wear turbans. And what we see with our gurus was, rather than bringing people down and saying, you're all equal, come down to our level, he would pick people up and say, you're all royal. So it's empowerment again. So that's where the tradition of the turban really comes from.
Jeremy, you had another question?
This maybe escaped me.
Oh, okay.
I guess I was thinking about what you were saying about Hindu names, because it isn't the Sikh religious language related to Sanskrit in origin, or?
It is in a way. Punjab, the homeland of the Sikhs is Punjab, which is now Pakistan and northwest India. This is where my parents grew up. This is where the founder of the tradition was born. This is where the kind of political and institutional centers of the tradition are. And a large majority of Sikhs live in this area. The language there is Punjabi. That's what I grew up speaking at home. A couple of things I'll mention as an opportunity to even mention kind of interfaithy stuff. Sure. One is that our scripture is not written in a single language. It's multiple different languages. And what we see is that the gurus, as they're composing, they're traveling around South and Central Asia, and they're speaking the languages of the people. So Sanskrit was the high-class language that that was reserved exclusively for priestly classes. And a majority of people didn't actually understand Sanskrit. So what would happen is you would end up relying on a middleman, a clergy person, to interpret your religion for you. And so the gurus rejected that. They wanted everyone to have access to religion, and so they spoke in the language of the people. And that meant the multiple different languages of the multiple different peoples they were interacting with. The language piece, Punjabi, is drawn from Sanskrit, but the vocabulary, the grammar is somewhat similar to modern Hindi and Urdu. But the vocabulary draws heavily from Persian. So it's its own distinct grammar. Linguistically, it's a distinct language, but the vocabulary you have drawing from what you could call the Islamic side, Persian, Arabic, Urdu, and also from, if you took it from a religious angle, from the Hindu side of Sanskrit and Braj, especially.
Simple question, what's the word Sikh mean?
Sikh comes from the Sanskrit word shishya, which means student or disciple. Mm-hmm. So in the relationship of the word guru means enlightener or teacher. So the relationship would be guru shishya, guru Sikh. You have the teacher and you have the learner. And we often interpret it to mean that we're lifelong learners. We're always seeking for growth and progress.
And as Christine will tell you, we Presbyterian ministers are teaching elders. Mm-hmm. We're teachers, not priests.
Yes, yeah, teaching elders, teaching and ruling elders. Yeah. So we don't do reverend, so-and-so. We do that sometimes, but we like the teacher role.
That's
we like the positionality of what that means for us.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And all the rest are rulers.
Yes.
So you guys were talking
John,
about
you have to go? Yes.
doing a lot more band-aid work than prevention.
Yeah.
I come from, I'm in education in schools. And
Great.
to me, prevention is kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it's raising a new class,
Sure.
a new society of educated, understanding individuals who
Right.
turn into adults who can get along with each other. But what I struggle with is keeping religion out of schools. And I wonder to you two what that looks like. How do you promote this understanding without naming religions in schools, because you can't. I mean, you can't.
Right. You want to share about how that's working with the curriculum?
Sure. So it is possible, and I experienced this in public schools growing up. religion is brought up in schools, and you talk about it historically, or in the context of world geography. And those are the two places where I learned about religion in school. From my childhood, that's where a majority of my knowledge about Judaism, Islam, and Christianity especially came from. So what we're doing with the coalition is, at the very least, bringing in those unrepresented traditions to the textbooks. So we've been working with the major textbook publishers around the country to include that, and also to have it included in the state guidelines for what the curricula, what needs to be included, the standards. So those are some basic things that we've been working on. We have also produced some lesson plans of how this could be taught in a classroom in a way that would cohere with requirements on church and state. But I think the general suggestion would be historical and geographical would be, social studies essentially would be a way to go. Another thing that we did in our schools growing up was we would essentially just approach our teachers or our administrators and say, this is an issue that's relevant to the people in our community. Can we do a special presentation because it's not being covered otherwise? And so then we would bring in a speaker. You could do the same at your school, or you could do the presentation yourself if you would like. But something like that was also really effective in the classroom.
I'd say
I think
that,
what I'm going to do
Okay.
is, if we could bring this part to a close.
Sure.
And then we'll have an official closing. Then if anybody has any more questions, they can do that.
I have
So I'd like to
response for you.
thank them for being here with us.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
There's begun a dialogue between the Sikh community and the Presbyterian community. And I believe it's very important for us to provide an opportunity for this dialogue to take place. You may recall that shortly after 9/11, the Sikh community suffered a lot of violence and of mistreatment following that. And we showed here during the first year of the Center at West Park a film that was about that whole experience. So this has been an issue that's been on our minds. And it's also part of our tradition as Presbyterians to seek to be leaders in that kind of dialogue as we begin to try and understand one another better. And with that, I would like to introduce my colleague Christine Hong from the Peace USA in Louisville, who's our national interfaith staff person. And you'll take it from there, Christine.
Sure, great. Simran and I are gonna, do you mind if we come sit right here?
Not at all.
Okay. So we started this dialogue specifically during this week because this is the United Nations week that they've declared as Interfaith Harmony Week. So during this week, we reflect on I guess what it takes to really build harmony and peace among religious peoples and among all peoples. And often when we celebrate interfaith harmony, we don't reflect on all of the blood, sweat, and tears it takes to get there. And we're not quite there yet. And so Interfaith Harmony Week is a time that we really reflect on how are we part of the process of building peace among all people. So I want to pass out this General Assembly, just really brief description of Interfaith Harmony Week that you can take with you and look at. And also, we will be doing a series of dialogues again in October of this coming year, or this year. And we want to pass out a sign-up sheet just so that we can keep in touch with you and let you know what's going to happen in the city, and there's a pen there too.
Yes, thank you.
But also just for you to send us your ideas of, as we've been doing this yesterday, we saw that a lot of folks were getting inspired on their own of how they could get involved in building more peace in their community. And so we want to hear your ideas too of what you could do possibly in your neighborhood or in your church. It's just a way, you can put whatever way you'd like for us to contact you and pull up. So before we start, or as we start, Simran and I just want to share with you why we're doing this. So it wasn't an accident that we came together, that we started a dialogue. The Presbyterian Church is coming forth to this General Assembly with an interreligious stance. And it's a stance that offers guidelines on how do we come into authentic and mutual relationship with persons of different faith traditions. And part of this development of this document was to bring together about 65 Presbyterians in Stony Point, New York, to have a really long conversation of what does this mean for us in our lives? How do we theologically approach this? How do we approach this in our neighborhoods, in our families? So we invited Simran to come and speak to us about how he felt, what he would like to see come out of this stance. And he said something really powerful that still sticks with me today. And he said, I'd like to see love infused into every part of what you say, of this policy. So after he said that, I was really excited. This is exactly what we want for the church. I was on this real just happy, spiritual uplift zone. I was really excited. And I get home and I get an email from him. And I'll let Simran share what that was about.
Sure. Yeah, it was the day after Christine and I met at the consultation. We met on a Friday, so this was a Saturday, and one of my good friends who's a professor at Columbia, another Sikh gentleman, was assaulted in a hate crime. And he was brutally beaten to the point he fractured his jaw, displaced his teeth. It was about 24 young boys who chased down my friend, yelling Osama, yelling terrorist, tackled him, and just puncture wounds in his arms, all sorts of things. So it was a really I guess emotional moment for many of us. In many ways, we've grown up knowing people who have been attacked, but this was my best friend, and it's also somebody who fits into the same profile as me. I'm also at Columbia University. I also live near where he does, and to think and to realize that this is happening in our own neighborhoods really woke me up to some issues that I had been trying to ignore or think weren't relevant to me and the people in my neighborhood. So this was the moment when Christine and I started connecting about what can we do here in the city and also around the country.
And I remember hearing this from Simran and feeling really helpless and thinking, what good is it for us as a church to create policy like this when we have no way of reacting now in a time of crisis, of someone that we invited to speak to us about love? And what good is it to have a document unless we have people doing the work?